And what I'm going to talk about is how I've tried to incorporate scientific skepticism and critical thinking in my courses where I'm teaching sensation and perception. So, for those of you who aren't in psychology, sensation and perception is a field where we're interested in understanding how the senses work. So how the senses take energy in the environment, convert that information into a neural signal so that it can be processed. And this is really important in psychology if we want to understand how the brain processes information, because we need to understand how the senses filter that information before it gets to the brain if we want to understand what's going on in the brain itself. Now, one of the things that makes sensation and perception one of my favorite things to teach is that it is a highly interdisciplinary course, not as interdisciplinary as disaster management maybe, but for psychology, it's very interdisciplinary. So not only do I talk about concepts that are important in psychology and neuroscience, but I also talk a bit about physics, I talk a bit about computer science, and even things like art and music. Now, even though that interdisciplinary nature makes it fun for me to teach, students often feel intimidated by a lot of the content. Psych students don't necessarily think that they're going to be learning about the electromagnetic spectrum when they come into a science or into a psych class. So my goal is to try and make the material as interesting and as approachable as possible. Now, one of the ways that I and most perception people do this is through the use of demonstrations. And in perception, we're lucky because we do have the best demonstrations in psychology. Even introductory psychology textbooks are framed around the use of visual illusions and other perceptual demonstrations to help illustrate concepts. And these aren't just fun things for students to do, they're really good at taking abstract concepts and making them concrete for the students. So I would not be a good perceptual psychologist if I didn't show you a couple of my favorite demonstrations. So in addition to what we had this morning, I've got a few more demos to show you. The first one that I use in my class is something called Aristotle's illusion. And I'll get you to demonstrate this for yourself. So Aristotle's illusion, the whole point is to try and illustrate the concept of the somatotopic map. The somatotopic map is a map of body space, and it describes how neurons in the somatosensory cortex, which is the receiving cortex for tactile information, is organized. Now, the whole point of the somatotopic map is that if you've got 2 points that are close together in body space, they're going to be processed close together in the cortex. Okay, so if I have 2 tactile points here, they're processed close together, and if I have 2 tactile points that are far apart, then they're going to be processed farther apart in the cortex. And as a consequence of this, if you have 2 tactile sensations that are close together, oftentimes your brain will only treat them as one tactile sensation because the brain can't resolve the difference between those 2 points. So you can demonstrate this for yourself with Aristotle's illusion. If you take whatever writing utensil you have, put up your middle and index fingers in your other hand, take your utensil, and just gently tap it between your 2 fingers. And just make a note of whether or not you feel 1 or 2 tactile sensations. Okay. Most of you will say you feel 1. That's because these 2 points in body space are close together, so that you're not resolved in the cortex. Now simply take your fingers, cross them, do the same thing. You get 2 distinct tactile sensations. That's because now you're stimulating 2 parts that are farther apart in body space, and so your brain is able to resolve that information. Okay, so one really quick and easy demonstration that you can use to illustrate a relatively complex concept in perception, the somatotopic map. The other demonstration I'll show you, and this one is my favorite, and this is why the lights are dimmed, so I'm hoping it works, because I'm used to being able to, whoops. Okay, I'm used to being able to control the lights in the room with no windows, and also we're in Edmonton, so half the time it's dark anyway, so I can just have the lights off and there's no ambient light. But this demonstration has to do with an important concept in color perception, which is the opponent process theory. I won't explain a lot about how that theory works, but in general, the theory states that when color information is being carried from the retina to the primary visual cortex, the color information is being carried in channels, where you have one channel that carries red and green information in opposition to one another, another one that carries blue and yellow information in opposition to one another, and another that carries black and white in opposition. Now, the reasons why this is, it takes quite a while to explain, so I won't describe it here, but I will say that one of the demonstrations we use to illustrate this concept that we process colors in opposites is to use color after effects. So with color after effects, if you adapt to one color for some period of time, that will fatigue the neurons, and as a result, that will shift what is perceived as neutral by those neurons, and you'll end up seeing the opposite color. Okay, now the way this is typically illustrated in textbooks is through the use of color inverted flags. Obviously, in the States, you use the American flag, and in Canada, we use the Canadian flag. But the whole point is that if you pick one of these flags, and if you stare at it for some period of time, okay, try not to move your eyes, what's happening is that the neurons that are processing that color are now becoming fatigued. And as a result, when I show you a neutral background, you'll end up seeing the opposite color. Okay, so I switch to a neutral white background. You see the flag. It's fun. It's nice. The use of flags is easy because they're obviously very familiar to people. It's really easy to create these color inverted images, but you get a much stronger demonstration when you use a more complex image. So here's another example. This is from an image I found online from Sequoia National Park, and what I've done is I've taken the image and then I've just created a color inverted image from that image. So what I want you to do is to stare at that fixation point. Try not to move your eyes. Try not to blink too much. I'm going to really try and get you to adapt to this one here. Okay, and again, what's going on is that the neurons that are processing the color on the screen are becoming fatigued. And so for each point in the space where you're processing that color, those neurons are going to end up seeing the opposite color. Okay, now keep your eyes fixated. I'll explain what's going to happen next. I'm going to switch to the next slide that has an image on it. And in that image, there's a fixation point in exactly the same location. So you don't have to move your eyes. But what I want you to make note of is whether or not you think the image is in color or if it's in black and white. Okay, and then once you've determined that, you can move your eyes. So I'm going to switch. Don't move your eyes. Look around. Okay, so it's a really nice, strong example of how you can illustrate that basically the brain reconstructs this color information and shows how it is that we're processing colors in opposites. So these are fun. Students love them, and it always gets a good reaction. But there's one thing that these demonstrations don't do, and that is they don't get the students thinking actively about some of the material that I'm teaching. They're great at passively experiencing these demonstrations, but they're not actively thinking about what's going on. And that's something I want to encourage them to do, is actively thinking about some of the theories and such that I'm teaching them. So to do this, I have started introducing products in my class for discussion, where I ask the students whether or not they think the products are legitimate products based on how we understand that the senses work. Okay? There's tons of these products out there that claim to influence our senses. There's things that help improve your vision. There's things that help improve your hearing. There's things that help mitigate pain experiences. And what's really neat is that a lot of these products are actually legitimate. Okay, so they do work based on how we understand that the sensory systems work. But of course, many of them aren't. And so what I want the students to do is to critically evaluate whether or not, based on what we've learned about the perceptual systems, whether or not they think that these products are valid. Okay? So the good thing is, because there's valid and invalid products, this promotes skeptical but not cynical thinking. So the students learn that they don't have to just dismiss everything as crap, but instead that they do have to walk through skeptically and think about whether or not some of these products are valid. So I'm going to walk through 4 products and show you how they can be used as teaching tools in a class like this. Okay. So the first type of product are dark adaptation goggles. So these are goggles or glasses that have red tinted lenses. And the logic is that if you wear them for about half an hour, and then you go into a dark environment and take the goggles off, then your eyes don't need to adjust to being in the dark. You're fully dark adapted once you've walked into the dark. Okay, now, at this point in the class, I will have talked about retinal physiology and how the cones and the rods work, which I won't do here. But I'll just ask, just kind of intuitively, how many people think that a product like this would be valid? How many people think that it would not be valid? Okay. These are an example of a valid product. Okay. They work really well. And it's actually really straightforward if you understand how the rods and the cones work, how these do, in fact, work themselves. So if you don't know, rods are the photoreceptors that are responsible for our night vision. They respond to low contrast information and things that are big and blobby, basically. Whereas the cones respond to color information and fine detail information, and they're responsible for our day vision. There's 2 differences in the way that the rods and the cones work that explain why these goggles work. Okay, the first is that the rods and the cones have different spectral sensitivities, meaning that they respond to different ranges of wavelengths. We interpret wavelength as color. Okay, so the rods respond to wavelengths between about 400 to 600 nanometers, whereas the cones respond to wavelengths between about 450 to 700 nanometers. This means that there's a range of wavelengths, especially above about 650 nanometers, where only the cones are working, the rods don't work. Okay, so if you are in a red environment, your rods aren't working, all of the information is coming from your cones. Second thing you need to know is how it is that our eyes adjust to being in the dark. Okay, this is referred to as dark adaptation. So, imagine I take you from a lit environment and I put you in a dark room, and I want to see how your eyes adjust to being in the dark. I can measure your light threshold about every minute that you're in the dark. Light threshold would be the minimum amount of light you need in order to detect that light. And if you have a lower threshold, that means better performance. Okay, so I put you in the dark environment, and after a minute, I measure your light threshold, and you find it's a little bit lower, so you're a bit better. Okay, another minute, again, you get a little bit lower, you're a bit better. Third minute, lower, better. And then after about 3 minutes, your threshold starts to level off, so you don't improve for a couple of minutes. But then, after about 5 minutes, all of a sudden you see this precipitous drop in threshold. Okay, so you get much, much more sensitive, and it improves very quickly until after about 25 minutes of being in the dark, and you're at that point fully dark adapted. You don't see any more improvements. So this shape of curve, this scallop shape, is very a hallmark of the dark adaptation curve. And anytime you see a nonlinear function like this, that typically means that there's 2 systems that are contributing. In this case, it's the rods and the cones. Okay? So this first part of the dark adaptation curve reflects adaptation of the cones. The cones adapt quickly, but they don't get very sensitive. The second part reflects adaptation of the rods. So the rods take longer to work, or to adapt, but then once they do adapt, they get much, much more sensitive. So if you think about what's going on when you're wearing these dark adaptation goggles, okay, you're wearing them for some period of time, the rods aren't working, so the rods are allowed to fully dark adapt. Okay? Once you take the goggles off, you're at this point in the curve, so your eyes don't need to adjust to being in the dark, so they're cool, they work like that. Okay? And it's really straightforward to explain how they work based on principles of how we understand the rods and the cones work. Okay, so this is a great example of a product that might seem fantastical, but when you walk through the logic based on sensory principles, they're absolutely legitimate products. Okay. So, the next type of product I will talk about are pinhole glasses. So pinhole glasses are glasses where you have an opaque surface, and then they've got these pinholes that are perforated throughout. And the idea is, if you look through a pinhole, you see a clear image. And this is based on an optical principle where if you have an optical system and you reduce the amount of light that comes into that optical system, that reduces the amount of blur, and it actually increases the crispness of the image in the optical system. Now, makers of these glasses will also claim that if you wear them for some prolonged period of time and you have an optical problem like myopia or hyperopia, that these will train your eyes to get better. So you will get better if you have one of these common visual problems. So I will ask again, how many people here think that this product would be a legitimate product? How many people think no? Excellent, good. They are not legitimate. It is important to note that the principle behind the pinhole optics is legitimate. And optometrists do use pinhole occluders. So if you have somebody come in and they have vision problems and you don't know what's causing the vision problems, if you get them to look through a pinhole and they see that the image is clear, then that tells you that whatever optical problem they have is due, or whatever problem they have is due to the optics of the eye. There's something in the refraction in the eye that's just going wonky. And if they don't, then that means it's something more serious, something that's further along in the visual processing. So the principle is real, but if you think about if you wore these glasses around every day and tried to use them as you would use any sort of normal glasses, you're losing over 90% of your visual field. So it'd be really impractical to go around looking at the world through these tiny little pinholes. So they're not practical for everyday use. And more importantly, it is patently false that if you wore them for some prolonged period of time, that would help your vision. Okay? The eye is not a muscle. It's not something that you can train. If you have an optical problem, the only way you fix that is with an optical solution such as glasses, contact lenses, or eye surgery that changes the optics of the eye. Okay, so again, an example of a product that might appear valid because of some of the principles, but in fact, they are not scientifically legitimate. So for the last two products I'll talk about, I'm going to switch gears and talk a little bit about pain perception. So pain, we don't really talk very much about pain perception in this class because pain itself is such a complex type of perception. There's multiple different types of pain. So there's inflammatory pain, there's neuropathic pain, there's nociceptive pain, and then there's huge cognitive components to how pain information is interpreted, and also emotional components. And so pain is a really messy type of perception to understand. But we do touch on it a bit because there is one type of pain perception that's very similar in the way that it operates as touch, as tactile perception. And that is nociceptive pain perception. So we do talk about nociceptive pain perception and how it interacts with the tactile system. So I'm going to talk about two pain products that claim to influence nociceptive pain. The first are a class of products that are designed to use vibration therapy. Okay, these products are, you have either patches or plates or something like that that you place against the body part that's in pain. They vibrate, and that mitigates the experience of the pain in the user. Okay, so how many people think that a product like that would be a legitimate product? How many people think no? Okay, this is an example of a class of legitimate products again. And again, it's the way that we understand that the nociceptive systems work and how they interact with touch, with the tactile systems. One of the leading theories of how touch and pain interact is the gate control theory of pain. This is a theory, so when you have nociceptive pain is mediated by receptors that are in the skin. Okay, when they're activated, if you do something to damage your skin, that causes a signal to be sent to your spinal cord. The spinal cord goes up to the cortex, and you process that as pain. It's the same type of pathway as tactile information follows. So when you touch your skin, the tactile mechanoreceptors take that signal, project it to spinal cord up to the brain. Now, it turns out that if you have both pain and touch information coming into the spinal cord at the same time, the touch, the tactile information can suppress the pain signal in the spinal cord. And this occurs because the tactile mechanoreceptors will activate cells called T cells. The T cells act as a gate. They suppress the signal coming from the nociceptors, so the nociceptor signal doesn't get sent up to the brain. Okay? This is why if you hurt yourself and you rub your body part, that rubbing provides that tactile stimulation that gates that pain signal, and it mitigates it so you don't feel as much pain. Okay? So again, product might not seem like it would be valid, but it is. You can actually mechanistically explain why these products, why these vibration therapies would work based on common sensory principles. So the last product or class of products I'll talk about are magnetic wearables. And the laughs tell me I don't probably have to take too much of a vote on the validity of these. But the idea is that these products have small magnets in them. Excuse me. And that the magnetic fields from those magnets interfere with pain signals and will therefore actually mitigate the experience of pain. Commonly, you find these types of treatments as bracelets. I've seen them as belts, as socks, as underwear. But again, the idea is that the magnetic field will mitigate that pain experience. So how many people think that this is a valid type of product? Excellent. I'm asking the wrong room here. How many think that it's not valid? Excellent. Great. Most of the students are pretty good with this one too, so I won't. And of course it's not. And it's really easy mechanistically to describe why these types of products wouldn't work. In order for something in the environment to have an influence over the senses and and pain in particular, there needs to be a way of taking that energy and transducing it into a neural signal. It has to be able to convert that energy into a neural signal. In humans, there are 4 types of transducers. There are phototransducers. Those are what take light energy and convert them into a neural signal. That's what happens in the eye with vision. There are mechanotransducers. Mechanotransducers take mechanical energy, such as sound or touch, basically, and convert that energy into a neural signal. So that's what happens in the ear and with touch. There are chemotransducers that take chemical energy and convert it to a neural signal. That happens in the nose and in the mouth with olfaction and gustation. And then finally, there's thermotransducers, which take temperature energy and convert that into a neural signal. Those are distributed throughout the body. Humans don't have magnetotransducers, so there's no mechanism in the human body that takes magnetic energy and converts it into a neural signal. Okay, they do exist in some animals. So birds and insects, for example, they will use energy from the Earth's magnetic field to navigate through the environment. And so magnetotransducers do exist in animals, but we don't have them as humans. So essentially, there's no mechanism by which we could logically argue that magnetic therapies would have any influence over pain. Okay, so just to finish off then, I hope that I've convinced you that sensation and perception is a powerful topic for teaching skepticism. What's kind of cool about this class is that we're already trying to teach the students to be skeptical because we're teaching them that their perceptions aren't true reflections of what's going on in the world. And so this is just kind of getting them to go that step further and asking them about product claims and how the products are supposed to work and whether or not that is consistent with how we understand that the sensory systems work. And so I would encourage you, if you can think of products like these in your own classes, either products or treatments or technologies where you can, especially if you can find good and bad examples and get the students talking about it. I've found that the students love discussing these types of products. Obviously, one of the ones I also talk about, I'm not going to bring it up here, but homeopathic treatments is one that they love laughing about, basically, when they see how ridiculous some of the claims are and how could a pill possibly cause the optics in your eye to change. And so it's good. It's kind of is a really good example for them. And I would, again, really encourage you, if you can find these products that are both valid and invalid, The goal isn't to teach the students to be cynical and to dismiss everything out of hand, but to be skeptical so that they can compare things and contrast things that they learn about. And ultimately what I'm just trying to do is to get them to be a little bit more curious and to think a little bit more critically about products that they'll encounter when they go out into the real world. So thank you very much.